I am Professor Lynn Porter of Fairfield University, and this is my lecture on Victorian architecture and decor. And I want to take a second here to just look at this photograph. This is the parlor of the Molly Brown house, which is in Denver, Colorado. Now, Molly Brown, if you've never heard of her, she's one of the most famous citizens of Colorado. She married a poor man who then instantly hit it rich in the mining that was happening in Colorado in the late 1800s. And with her newfound wealth, she became a famous philanthropist and socialite. The thing that really made her famous was the fact that she was on the Titanic when the Titanic most famously went down. She survived and was one of the people who was saved off of the lifeboats. Her mythic status was cemented when a musical was written about her called The Unsinkable Molly Brown. So, anyway, that's Molly Brown. But look at her parlor. Just look at this. This is arranged for a party in 1910. So everything we've got in this room, we've got a beautiful piano, we've got these very comfortable pieces of furniture, we have this swag of drapery over the archway into the front hall, we've got a number of very heavily framed items on the walls, even hanging up over the cornice on the wall there. We have something going on with that chandelier. We've got all of these plants. Good Lord, these plants. And even this bearskin rug, literally a bearskin rug on the floor here. So we have this room that's packed with decoration, not necessarily in a pretty way, but definitely in an overwhelming, kind of astounding way. And that, in a nutshell, is kind of the Victorian look. These are all the things I'm going to talk about in this lecture. When in time we're talking about, as well as what's going on socially at the time, the basic concepts of the design. And then I want to emphasize that the Victorian age was about revivals. So we've already looked a little bit at the Greek revival, but there was also a Gothic revival, an Italian Renaissance revival, the second Ampere revival, exotic revivals from Islam and Egypt, a Romanesque revival, and then some eclectic styles with the Beaux-Arts, Châteauesque, Neo-Renaissance, and Neoclassical revivals. So this is a period of revivals. We're also going to take a look at the new things happening, which we see the first skyscrapers happening at this time. And then we're also going to look at some of the interiors and how the Victorian age affected what's going on inside. The Victorian age, it's very easy to set the time period because this is the time when Victoria was on the throne in England. And so while this is a British idea, it is used to pretty much describe what was going on throughout Western culture from the middle of the 19th century through the turn of the 20th century. So what's going on at the time? Politically, we bookmark the beginning and the end of this period with Victoria becoming queen in 1837 and then dying in 1901. Those are the two ends of the Victorian era. But in the middle there, in 1848, you have Karl Marx starting to talk about communism. You have Britain taking over India. You have the US Civil War both beginning and ending in the middle of the century. So, this is a time when Britain is expanding its footprint on the world, while the United States is still fighting over what the United States really should be. This is a time that is still the Industrial Revolution, so there's a huge amount of technology changing. In 1844, Mr. Morse sends his first telegram. In 1848, we have the first operation under anesthesia. It's not the first operation, but the first time under anesthesia. By 63, we're talking about regular home delivery of mail. 69, the Suez Canal opens, and that's going to affect trade around the world. And then by the end of this period, we have the first transatlantic telegraph transmission. So we're still having a lot of developments happening in technology. And of course, technological developments mean social developments. We have Frederick Douglass publishing Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. We have gold being discovered in California, driving people west across the United States. In 1870, in the United States, the African American men finally get the vote. 1876, Germany starts the idea of refrigeration of food, and by the end of the century, Freud publishes the interpretation of dreams. So this is a time of great discoveries and movement forward socially also. And there's four major concepts that the Victorians really value. The first one is the idea of things being modern and progressive. Now we're having items made by machine. Everything is not handmade anymore. And we also have lots of new materials that are more durable, they're more colorful, they're more cleanable than old-fashioned things. And in particular, the Victorians prized new materials that look like old materials that symbolized wealth. And they also liked old materials that are being used in new ways. And I want to show you several concepts here. Here you have two items from the Victorian age that really exemplify this idea. On the left, you have a bust of Charles Dickens, and it's not about Dickens, it's the fact that it's Parian ware. Parian is faux marble. So here we have this porcelain that is able to look like marble. And so you have this explosion of all kinds of busts and statuary made to look old, but it's with a new material. And on the right here, you have an étagère, which is that curious little shelf that you use to put knickknacks on. But it's made out of paper mache. Yes, that material you used as a child using newspaper and glue, but now we're using this newspaper and glue idea to make old-fashioned looking pieces of furniture. How curious, right? So those are two examples of new materials that imitate the look of old things or old materials used in new ways. The second thing that the Victorians valued is historicism. As basically, if it's old and if it's historical, that somehow it has value to it. So because age and longevity seem to have certain characteristics that make them respectable, they also signify taste and education. So choosing to decorate in an historical style proves that you've got culture and good taste. The third thing that Victorians value is gentility and acceptability, which historical objects seem to convey. This is a period of everybody being overtly respectable, which leads to our fourth value, which is morality. So good style is good design, which shows that you have good morals. And because middle class women are now in charge of decorating their houses, so the houses can become a place of culture and taste and education for the children. So the home is a refuge from that immoral world outside the house, but inside the house, we are very, very respectable. This is the age of respectability. So when we look at how the architecture is happening in this period, we realize that it's a series of revivals. And think about it. Technology and progress is moving forward, and style is looking backward. It's a not uncommon thing to happen in societies. In fact, I think we're seeing some of that happen in the United States today. So, yeah, we have a lot of revivals. We're looking backwards to ancient Greece, to the medieval period with the Gothic revival, then the Italian Renaissance, the Second Empire in France, Rococo, what's going on in Islam and Egypt, Romanesque, and then the Beaux-Arts, Châteauesque, Neo-Renaissance, and Neoclassical revivals. It's like, good Lord, how many revivals could we actually have in one period of time? This is fascinating. And I've got examples of each, and I'm going to use examples from both the United States and Britain. So starting with the Greek revival, I'm going to start in England. And remember, this is a Greek, not a Roman style. We've seen this building before. This is the Ashmolean Museum, iconic Greek revival. Let's take a look at Greek revival in America. Now we're following the American Revolution, so there's this strong idea of nationalism, of the United States as this new nation. And leaders like Thomas Jefferson look back to classical antiquity, Greek in particular, as the source of beauty and as the ideal of civic virtue and morality. And also Jefferson, he was one of our founding fathers. They looked back to ancient Greece as the ideal of a democracy. Our country's founding documents are based on ancient Greek ideas. So it makes sense for our founding fathers to look to ancient Greece as a design ideal. Here in Philadelphia, we have the Second Bank of the United States from the early decades of the 1800s. And you see how this bank looks very much like a Greek temple, doesn't it? So we're lifting that idea from a temple to Athena, and now we're making it this a temple to commerce or a temple to capitalism in this country. But definitely the ideal of something being strong and important and deeply rooted, which is really what you want for a bank, right? So in this period, you also have the Gothic revival, and I'm going to first look at England here. Now, most of the countries in Europe all claim to be where the Gothic style began. So the Gothic style is a homegrown style, not from the ancient classical world, but it's also visually complex and fanciful in its own way. So there's lots of reasons for England, France, and Germany to be claiming that this is their national style. Here is one of the examples of the Gothic revival in England. Here we have the Royal Courts of Justice in London. Now remember, in the Middle Ages, we had the Gothic style growing up in the churches. But here now we're taking those same ideas and now we're translating that into the courts of justice. Interesting transition there, isn't it? On the American side of the Atlantic, the designers downsized the Gothic idea and simplified it to create a much more modest American style. One of the iconic buildings of this style is Roch House, which is in Massachusetts. And you see, this is a domestic building. This is literally someone's house. And it has some flavor of that Gothic look, doesn't it? Here is a photograph of Roch House as it stands today. Isn't that fascinating, taking that rather ecclesiastical idea and now we're literally making it a domestic idea. Of course, this is highly simplified, but you can see the pieces. You can see those pointed arch windows. You can see that Gothic tracery along that really steep roof line. So the Gothic idea bled into the domestic architecture. However, in the middle of New York City, there is a Gothic revival cathedral, St. Patrick's. And the curiosity of this building isn't the structure itself, it's the context. When you are walking through all of the skyscrapers in Midtown Manhattan, you don't expect to turn a corner onto Fifth Avenue and see a Gothic cathedral. But there you have it. Of course, New York City didn't always have skyscrapers, so for a time there, St. Patrick's Cathedral was the tallest structure in the city and the second highest in the country. And this is a photograph from 1913 to just give you a sense of that context. Moving along to the Italian Renaissance revival in both England and America, some designers were bored with those eternal classical motifs, so the Italian Renaissance domestic architecture became rather inspiring. And they saw those domestic buildings, those palazzi, as an expression of culture and wealth and luxury, but they're not interested in the order and the harmony and proportions of the Italian examples. So some of the proportions got a little out of whack. This is an English example. Here we have the Reform Club in London. It was founded to be a private men's club for those who were interested in progressive politics. But look at it. Doesn't it look like an Italian palazzo? That three-story structure with the bottom being a little more rusticated and then moving up and getting more delicate as it moves up. And that really deep cornice under that flat roof. So yeah, we have all of that happening. There's also some Italian coins going up that corner, those decorative blocks going up the corners of the buildings. So this feels very much like a Renaissance palazzo, but very big. Here is an example of the Italian Renaissance revival from Philadelphia. This is the Athenaeum, which clearly is based on an Italian Renaissance palazzo design. It's smaller than the English example I just showed you, but it's still the same style. The Athenaeum is a special collections library and museum for collecting materials having to do with the history of America. So you see how the designers were drawing that link between the antiquities of America and antiquities from the classical world. Here is an iconic domestic version of the Italian Renaissance revival in America. This is the Morse Libby House, also called Victoria Mansion. And you can see with this building how it borrows many of the architectural developments of the Italian Renaissance, and they're arranged in an interesting way in this interesting looking house. This house does tend to feel a little bit Italian, and that has everything to do with that central tower with the high curved arches at the very top with that big flat roof on it. That tends to feel like an Italian campanile, a bell tower. And then if you look closely, you see those coins up the sides of all the corners. You see the segmental and pointed pediments above the windows. You see that really deep overhang from the roof as mimicking that idea of the top cap of an Italian palazzo. And we even have a mini version of that separating the first and the second floors here. So there's many Italian Renaissance ideas being expressed here in this elegant house. Moving along to the second Empire style. This is also called Napoleon III style, as Napoleon III was the emperor at the time. And this was the style that was used to make this new Louvre, and then that became the model of sophistication and being a cosmopolitan and very, very French. And as we've said multiple times this semester, the French tend to be leading the pack in terms of design styles. This is considered an eclectic style because it takes elements of several different styles. And this is part French Renaissance, part Palladian, and part French Baroque, all combined in this new style. Here is a photograph of the Louvre, and you see all of the classical elements that have been combined in the Palladian and the Renaissance styles. You also see that very French, really steep slate roof that is a recurring theme with French architecture. The Louvre is the largest art museum in the world, and when you are in France, you must go. In America, the Second Empire style has a lot of those same features we just saw in the Louvre, right? It has those classical elements. It has that very iconic French roof. This is the Corcoran Gallery of Art. It was one of the first fine art galleries in the United States. It's now one of the Smithsonian museums in Washington, D.C. And architecturally, you can see the very clear links between this building and the Louvre we just looked at. In the Victorian era, we also have various exotic revivals, and this has to do with people from the West looking east and being fascinated with those other cultures. And so we're looking at some of the Middle Eastern cultures, what is now present-day Turkey or Islam, or what was the Persian Empire. Also the Moorish land across the Middle East and across the top of the African continent, and of course the Egyptian culture from northeastern Africa. And all of these cultures are prized not for their cultures, but for their decorative objects. For an example of the exotic revival in England, I'm showing you the Arab Hall of Lord Leighton House. Now, Lord Leighton was a painter, and he traveled to the Middle East and collected hundreds of tiles that were made from the 14th to the 17th century. So he came home with buckets and buckets and buckets of these beautiful Islamic tiles, and he had this room built specifically so that those tiles could be installed and shown in a way like they would have been in Islam. So this is one of those buildings that's a curiosity. The outside of the building is an English brick building, and on the inside there is this beautiful Islamic room. An example of the Islamic revival in America is Olana, which is a house that was built by and for the artist Frederick Edwin Church, who was a painter in the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting. And so this building is a mixture of the Victorian aesthetic of crowding stuff into a room along with Persian and Moorish styles. So it's this odd, eclectic, mashing together glory of the Middle Eastern styles. And I just have to show you this next building. This is still exotic revival, and we're still in America, but this is Egyptian revival. Now, this is the Tombs, which is in Lower Manhattan, New York. It's the jail for criminals awaiting their trial. And look at this building. Oh my goodness, you see why it's Egyptian revival. You see those lotus blossom columns and that sloping wall that mimics the pylon from those ancient Egyptian temples that we were looking at. And here's a photograph of it. It even had that really deep Cavetto molding up at the top of the wall. This building was doomed before it was even built, and it has since been destroyed because it was built on a landfill that hadn't been packed properly. And this entire building started to sink not long after it was opened up. And of course, it had a damp foundation and all of those things. Since then, New York City has replaced it with actually four different structures, but all of them carry the Tombs as the nickname. And this building is why it's called the Tombs, because it looks like one of those ancient Egyptian temples. Moving along, let's look at the Romanesque revival. And as soon as you had the Gothic revival, you had a response to it, the Romanesque one, because designers thought that it was superior to the Gothic because it was even simpler and more economical. And just as we saw with the Gothic revival, the the ideas that were basically built in the Catholic churches became used for other things when you get to the Victorian era and you get to all of these revivals. So here you see the main entrance to the Natural History Museum in London that clearly harkens back to a Romanesque church. But then you take a step back and you see the rest of the building and you realize, oh, this is not a church at all. It is a massive structure, but it has that basic element of that Romanesque facade. Remember the features of the Romanesque? You have that large central portal, you frequently have two towers, you have the half circle Roman arch, that's where it gets the Romanesque name. You have the doorway surrounded by those archivolts that kind of lead your eye directly into the opening itself. Yeah, this feels like a Romanesque church, but it's not at all. When the Romanesque revival hit the United States, it became Richardsonian Romanesque, named after the architect, Mr. Richardson, who popularized the style in this country. And his work was seen as strong and powerful and majestic, all of those things that make the Romanesque style feel heavy. One of the iconic works of Richardson is Trinity Church from Boston. This is in Copley Square in Boston, and many of you may have walked past this building. You see how it takes so many of those elements from a Romanesque church. The three portals down below, the central one is larger. The archivolts that in this photograph are harder to see because they're dark. That rather ubiquitous use of the Romanesque arch, the twin towers, and even the decoration on the outside of the building feels very Romanesque, doesn't it? You have those long, slender characters. They seem a little stretched out. They don't seem to have a particular expression. They're not personalized. They're rather abstract versions of people. You also see grotesques. Look at the capitals of the columns that have various animal forms in them. So yeah, we have a lot of those ideas from the Romanesque churches of the Middle Ages now being used and reused and reinvented in the United States as a Richardsonian Romanesque style. But I don't want you to get the impression that Richardsonian Romanesque is only used in churches, because it mostly wasn't. It's just that Trinity Church is one of his most famous buildings, that this style was used in all different types of buildings, most frequently in public buildings like libraries and town halls. And this style was then copied across the United States by quite a few other architects. So in the late 1880s and early 1900s, there was a pushback against all of this rather random and odd use of historical styles. And so this whole eclectic idea is leaning back toward making compositions that are more correct in terms of the archaeological historical record, and being very specific about what forms you are borrowing from or what details are your prototypes. And you see these styles being used in monumental structures, but all of them using the contemporary materials. So we're maintaining that contemporary materials of the Victorian times. The first eclectic style I want to share with you is the Beaux-Arts style, which grew out of the School of Beaux-Arts in Paris, where they came up with a very particular look for what is a Beaux-Arts style building. And this is all based on the classical tradition of ancient Rome and the Italian Renaissance and a little bit of the Baroque into 17th, 18th century France. So the buildings are classical, they are symmetrical, and in every facade you will see five things: a center emphasis, a rusticated ground floor, smooth stones on their upper floors, planes that advance and recede. That means some come forward and some move backwards in space. And then an emphasis on the corners of the building. So there's stuff uh, ladled up onto the corners. You will see dramatic skylines and roof balustrades and grand staircases. So these are the elements that we see in the Beaux-Arts style. One of the most famous examples of this style in the United States is the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There you go, all of those classical elements. And here you see the centerpiece of the facade. There's a wing left and a wing right of here. So this is the central portion of it. So you see what I mean about elements that are pulling forward and elements that are pushed back, that advancing and receding planes, this massive staircase that you climb to get up into the structure, that dramatic skyline with balustrades, all of that is a very Beaux-Arts look. Another eclectic style is the Châteauesque, and this is based on the French chateaux built around the French Renaissance. And it tends to be more popular in the United States than in Europe. The characteristics tend to be very vertical and picturesque, a little bit of a fairy tale look. They tend to be asymmetrical and have towers or turrets. They tend to have either pointed openings or that onion-shaped opening. That onion shape is called an ogee. And then tall and steeply pitched roofs, just like we've seen on all of those French buildings. An iconic example of this style is the Biltmore Estate down in Asheville, North Carolina. You see what I mean about it being vertical and very picturesque? It's asymmetrical, but obviously beautifully planned. It has those turrets and towers. It has that steeply pitched roof and those spires, those pinnacles, that beautiful skyline to it. This was built by one of the Vanderbilts as a little mountain escape up in the mountains of western North Carolina. It is the largest privately owned house in the United States. And if you're ever in Western Carolina, it's always worth your time to stop into the Biltmore Estate. With the eclectic style, we also have a neo-Renaissance style, which emulates those Italian palaces and villas, but on a huge scale. So these are not domestic buildings, but they're borrowing that palazzo architecture. So you have these rectangular block forms with the various stories. Lower levels are rusticated, and then you have either arched or rectangular openings. You definitely have those coins and that flat or the low-pitched roof. And one of the iconic buildings in this style is the Boston Public Library. So now we're borrowing the domestic Italian palazzo architecture for massive public structures in this country. And you knew it had to happen sometime. We have had a classical period and then we've had neoclassical periods. So now we're having a neoclassical revival, which emulates all of those neoclassical prototypes and the Greek revival, but tends to be less theatrical than the Beaux-Arts version of the classic style. So you will see symmetrical buildings with the Greek orders, rusticated lower levels and smooth upper levels, flat roofs and porticos. And one of the most famous examples of this style in this country is our Supreme Court building. This is the west facade of the building, the center portion of it, and you see we have that very strong neoclassical temple style. And this building was built as a temple to justice. This building was intentionally built massive, and that sends a message through the architecture that because our three branches of government are equal in weight, the judicial system needs a building as grand as the Houses of Congress and the White House. So with this building, we are now at the end of all of the revivals that I wanted to share with you in this lecture. But there were some really interesting new things happening too, like skyscrapers. They started in the United States. The first skyscraper is in Chicago, the Home Insurance Building, which opened in 1885. And it was the first very tall building to be supported not by the stonework, but by an internal structural metal frame that holds up the building. And because it's not a massive pile of rocks, of masonry, it became a lighter structure. And that's one of the main things that had to be in place in order to build very, very tall buildings. You had to cut down on the weight on the lowest levels. And so this internal metal framework is one of the key elements. Another technological advance that allowed skyscrapers to come to pass was the elevator. Now, the technology of an elevator has been around for millennia. It's a simple pulley system. So that's nothing new. But what Mr. Otis did in the 1850s was he invented an emergency brake. So if the cables carrying the elevator car snapped, the car would stop in place and not send the occupants plummeting to their death. That emergency braking system is what allowed them to actually be installed in buildings. So that was Mr. Otis's contribution to the elevator. Not the elevator, but the brake. So let's take a look at the world's first skyscraper. There you go. Are you a little surprised? I know I was surprised the first time I saw this because it's a 10-story building. Seriously, that's a skyscraper? Yeah, it is. And it has to do with that structural metal frame, the steel frame, and the fact that it's not the stonework holding up the building, it's the steel frame holding up the building. This is an image taken from a postcard from Chicago from around the turn of the century. About 15 years after it opened, they decided to make it even taller. So two more floors were built onto the top of the structure in the 1890s. One of the curiosities of this building is that it looks like a stone building because it has that outer cladding of masonry. And as skyscrapers were developed after this, more and more architects realized we don't have to dress up a building with stonework in order to make it stand up or in order for people to believe that it will stand up. And so you start to see later in the 20th century so many of the skyscrapers that move away from stonework on the exterior and into more metal and glass. We've been mostly looking at exteriors of buildings, so I do want to spend some time on the interiors. And the characteristics are pretty simple. It is an eclectic use of all previous furniture and decorative styles. So you see multiple styles kind of stacked up on top of each other in very, very crowded rooms with wallpapers that tend to have a pretty heavy, pretty bold pattern. Lots of draperies, layers of draperies, often with very theatrical swags. So the drapery is not simply blocking the light coming through a window, but it's helping frame it in some beautiful way. And again, very crowded walls, often with paintings over paintings, and exotic indoor plants, especially the palm plant and the rubber plant. And that has everything to do with international trade and proving that you are a person of the world by having these exotic plants in your house. Here we have the parlor of the Colonel Robert Milligan House in Brooklyn. And you see what I mean about the heavily patterned wallpaper and the theatrical draperies. I don't see any plants here, but you see this rather Baroque dressing of the picture frames, the heavily upholstered furniture. You see those really massive circular paintings that are hung with those really long chains from up above. All of that is a very Victorian look. And if you look to the very far right of this image, you'll see a bust on a pedestal, and that looks to me like Queen Victoria herself. Here's another lovely interior. This is the drawing room of Stanmore Hall in Middlesex. And again, you see the heavy wallpaper, the patterns on the patterns. Here you see the palm plants in the foreground, and in the middle of the background, you see a rubber plant kind of holding pride of place in the center of the room. You see the comfortable furniture, but you see it's got upholstery all the way down, completely covering the legs. That is a feature. Again, remember this was a style of modesty, and sometimes that meant even the legs of furniture couldn't be displayed. Here we have another Victorian drawing room and the lady of the house at the piano in the center of the room. Again, you see the heavy wallpaper and the heavy draperies. And so that archway with the theatrical draperies, there it's asymmetrical and very wonderfully swagged. You see drapery across the top of the piano. You see it across the top of the fireplace, across the mirror above the fireplace. So it's all about these beautiful textures and these really rich fabrics that are just draped in a rather theatrical way, one on top of each other. And again, there's just a little too much stuff in this room. You see what I mean? Here is a lovely Victorian lady and her cat in her drawing room. Heavy wallpaper, that palm tree, the drapery across the table and the piano, and the stuff, the stuff, the stuff. If there is wall space, there's something there. It looks like she has some wonderful paintings. She's got plates on the wall. She's just filling the space with stuff. That is a very Victorian look. Another image of nice Victorian ladies in their drawing rooms. Look at that massive wallpaper. That pattern just does not quit. And the stuff on the walls, the stuff. And it's not like things are hung at eye height so you can look at them. It's really about having this overall feeling of this room being filled with beautiful things, not necessarily from the period. So this may be stuff that has come down in the family, but if we own it, we're going to display it because that is how we show our sense of culture. So if we're going to take the whole Victorian thing and just kind of put it in a nutshell, we're talking about a total excess of ornament with these revivals of historical styles, kind of mixing and matching elements from historical styles, mixed with some Middle Eastern and some Asian influences. It is a period that's just this mad mix of all kinds of influences. And this is what we've talked about here today. Wow, all those revivals. Thank you for your time.